I'm Georgina Jalbo from Lexis PSL Private Client, and I'm delighted to welcome Charlotte Harris and Gerard Cukier, who are partners in the dispute resolution team at Kingsley Napley. And Charlotte and Gerard have come to talk to us about some current issues in privacy law. So thanks for coming in this afternoon.
Pleasure.
Many of your clients are high net worth individuals. What sort of issues arise for the children of such individuals, particularly when their parents are under scrutiny from the press?
Well, in the last year or so, there's been quite a lot of news coverage of disputes that have arisen where there have been photographs in the press of the children of not just celebrities, but individuals who have come to the media's attention for other reasons. So, for instance, if there is some kind of scandal around a business and the business leader has been in the press, their wider family can also be of interest. And the other, I suppose the other generational thing that is happening is that there's a much more vocal younger generation who use social media in such a way that obviously if there's going to be some kind of article in the newspaper, it may not be that easy to find out private information about the parent who is the main target, but it might be far easier for a journalist to find out information about the wider family and children, and perhaps even find out information about the parents from that. So for instance, it's extremely usual to post Facebook photographs or to go on to many other sites, and they come up and we might not necessarily use them ourselves, but it's Snapchat and Instagram and Bumble, and there's dating sites as well that are that are used. And when you start being able to simply search the name of a high net worth individual or celebrity or sports person's child, and then family photographs appear, it can be, I think, quite tempting for journalists to run down that route.
Yes.
And inevitably, they seem to always get these photographs these days. Whenever there's a story about some type, very often it comes out they found it on Facebook, which is supposed to be private, for example. But
well, it's the privacy
controls are
settings change, don't they, on Facebook? And sometimes it might be the run of the story. So you might have a story in a Sunday newspaper about a particular high net worth individual, and by Tuesday there's nothing else they can print. And so sometimes it's a sort of midweek stories where, what have they posted about their daughter, for instance, and what photographs can we find? But there's also a security issue that's important. So even if you're not the subject of a particular piece of media attention, it's the private security information that can come out very easily, like where you live, or what your daily routine is, or where you've been, or if you say that you're on holiday and post pictures, is there anyone in the house, what time do the dogs go for a walk, all of this sort of stuff mean that people can find out your password, and this sort of security risk can then end up leading to your financial information getting out of there, or in extreme cases we've had inquiries that have been blackmail, where a bit of information have been found out about somebody and then they threatened to post it. Young people being blackmailed over photographs that they've sent sometimes to simply other young people, but they happen to come from a particular type of family, and it's very difficult for young people to deal with that. It can cause terrible difficulties.
Right.
Yeah.
And since the Leveson inquiry, there's been a downturn in the classic celebrity scandal, and this has been replaced by an upturn in public interest investigations, which can perhaps be more readily justified to the courts. What sort of issues have your clients experienced in the last year in terms of press interest?
Okay. Well, obviously, leading up to the election, what was quite not uncommon was that there were high-profile people that, for example, were making political contributions to various parties. So that was something that the press were inevitably looking at, mainly maybe because of past scandals and cash for honours, that sort of thing. Equally, when it comes to making charitable donations, again, that's something that the media now are looking at, and they're starting to question the motives for people doing that sort of thing. So that's the sort of thing that the press are looking at, and people have got to be aware of and maybe conscious that the media are interested in those sorts of subjects, and if it is reported there's something which is either wrong or possibly defamatory, there are things that can be done to correct something which is printed which is either misleading or incorrect or factually wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a real shift, hasn't there, in who are the targets for the front page. If we go back to 2010 and we look at the sort of stories that were running during, for instance, the World Cup, there was so much money was being poured out from the newspapers, who were prepared to pay big prices for stories that were about the private lives of, for instance, footballers, and this could become, headline news on all the channels. But that's changed. There was what was the super injunction spring, where the public and the newspapers got pretty sick of the super injunction situation or injunction situation, and said, no, we have a right to know, and it became very difficult. Some years ago, if you didn't like the story, you could at least make a very hopeful application for an injunction. But then we had all these difficulties with anonymity, and things changed. We had the Leveson inquiry, which really balanced that, because it showed some of the bad practices that were happening behind the scenes, and as a result, journalists now, particularly ones coming up into newspapers, appear to be far more interested in the rather safer territory of public interest.
Yes, absolutely.
And that means that there are different targets. So if, for instance, you're making a political donation, people will look at it. If you are a member of Parliament,
scrutinise
you're going to be
whether there's an ulterior
scrutinised.
motive for that sort of thing. Another example of sort of thing that's happening is over the recent years, obviously, the government's been clamping down on, for example, tax avoidance schemes. So this is something which is coming up more and more. People, inevitably high net worth individuals, have invested through top advisors in schemes which they are told will work when it comes to saving tax, but because of the philosophy and the government wanting to cut back on these sorts of schemes, invariably they've been challenged. And then the question becomes, was what they were doing, what they were involved in, through no fault of their own, because they were advised that these were absolutely proper schemes, was it tax evasion, which is a criminal offence, or was it tax avoidance, which is legitimate, but is being challenged, as I said, by the government. So that is something, again, that is coming up, and what happens very often is that people who are high profile, through no fault of their own, they become the subject of newspaper stories, and they're more serious newspapers as well. We're not talking about the red top press, we're talking about more serious things.
Red top press consider themselves to be extremely
serious.
True.
That's true, exactly. But so that's the sort of thing that, again,
do you know what the other thing, Gerard, is as well? Family proceedings. I mean, this is the thing that, particularly if you look at some of the papers like Standard, Evening Standard, done a huge run in family proceedings, and particularly if you're a high net worth person and you are going through a divorce, that's of great interest, or the criminal allegations.
Absolutely, the sort of lifestyle that people
anything like that. Right up there. So it's different news stories, different inquiries, a real shift in the way that we handle them as well. Probably much more difficult now, I would have thought.
And so, following on from that, would you say it's difficult these days to maintain a high public profile whilst maintaining your privacy?
Well, that's probably
Well, I think it always has been difficult to balance the two, but the newspapers now, I think, are very well versed in scrutinising how you present yourself publicly, because there's so many more ways of presenting yourself publicly. If we were in a situation where, in order to build your public profile, you were reliant on PRs and PR firms, and whether a newspaper would run, a fabulous story in female about you, that would be a different matter. But now, it can just be that, as we discussed before, you've used your social media or you've raised your own profile. A bloggist can have more readers than a newspaper. But then, in terms of things coming back to haunt you, these holiday snaps, or if you are a celebrity and you take your child, which is quite understandable that you would nobody criticises us when we bring our children to work.
No.
But if you bring your child to a premiere and they're snapped on the red carpet, then 4 years later, a newspaper might argue
but
with you.
But isn't the attitude, maybe it's that to the public, that if you are high profile and you are popular in the media, or you use the media to benefit your career, then you ask for fair game. Isn't that the way they look at these things these days?
Well, quite often it can be very difficult. There are those sacrosanct things, though.
Yes.
So, right at the heart of privacy law, your financial information, and and your medical information, and really, any intimate details to do with your relationships. But even those can come back to haunt you. If, for instance, you had survived an illness and you wanted to talk about it, or you were involved in a charity that supported medical research, suppose you could even find yourself a target as a result of that, even though that sounds awful.
So if you put that information out there, then it's fair game?
Well, no, I'm not saying it's fair game. I'm saying that if you put that information out there, then it may be argued by people who want to publish this information that it can be justified on those grounds.
Okay.
That's right. And also there's this if you take a stance on a particular situation, if you're a politician, for example, and you uphold family values, but it turns out that maybe you're not adhering to your principles, again, that's the sort of thing that the press and the media will pick up, and they'll be able to justify on the basis of public interest.
Yes, family values, hostage to fortune.
Those sort of things, absolutely. But not only politicians, but there are high value, there are high, again, people who are in that sort of bracket, that because they are public figures, they will attract attention, and invariably the media will be looking at what they're doing and seeing whether there's something that they can report if they think it's of interest to the public.
And, on a related matter, what sort of difficulties do you find high net worth individuals are having with data stored on them?
Right. Okay. Well, as you know, these days, whenever a professional, whether it's a bank, whether it's a solicitor, or it's an accountant, takes on any new client, they have very, very strict rules and regulations about making sure you know exactly who your client is, and what their background is, and so on. So what these professional bodies invariably do is they rely on these companies that gather together worldwide huge amounts of data, and these data information systems, which have sort of become the standard when it comes to doing due diligence, actually. But the fact is that what these companies do is they are essentially gathering information which is being reported, very often without actually checking it. So, for example, you may have a businessman that's over in this country, for example, maybe come from somewhere like Greece, for example, where there's been serious financial problems, and invariably banks have collapsed, and there have been other companies that have found themselves in difficulties. So that's the sort of thing that will actually gain headline news in the newspapers in Greece, for example, as an example. That sort of information will appear on the database. It may not necessarily be true, but because it's sensational and it's reported, that's what appears. So when that particular businessman, for example, then comes over to the UK, wants to invest in business over here, the banks, the solicitors, the accountants will be doing their searches on these databases, and they will find that, you see, and that can actually be very, very difficult. But there are remedies over here. Again, if it's defamatory, if it's wrong, you are entitled to get it corrected.
Or out of date.
Or out of date, absolutely.
But
it's the sort of things that we are finding increasingly is coming up. A lot of our clients are finding these sort of difficult people who are coming from abroad, who have come to the UK, which is something which is happening a lot these days. And we are able to make contact with the database companies and correct things.
And that's something that you do on behalf of your clients?
Absolutely, and we've done it a few times successfully. And
sometimes it can take a long time to even know that it's going on, because they're not under
You-
necessarily any
no,
duty
no,
to
no.
tell you that you're on these
No,
databases, and so you might be turned down and think that there are all sorts of other reasons.
And it very embarrassing as well.
And it can be quite challenging as well to get these things down. And I would have thought without legal representation even harder. So it's sometimes it's the newspaper articles that ought to have never, we would say sometimes, shouldn't have been printed in the first place. So for instance, if somebody has been arrested as part of an investigation and never charged,
Absolutely.
we would have thought they shouldn't have been named on arrest, but sometimes the cat's out the bag and they've been named, and then even though they've never been charged and they're not being investigated, and it's been
That's the entry. That's the entry that appears, although it's historically it's no longer relevant.
Which
absolutely. But that's what appears.
Which
so,
means that you have less rights than
Yeah.
if you'd been convicted and done your sentence.
True.
Which is
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your insights on this fascinating and fast-moving area of law. I hope you all found it interesting.
Thank you very much.